Good evening, Walter. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
Very good, thanks. Yeah, morning here, evening at your end. We're spanning the globe, so hopefully the time delay won't be too bad. Yeah. Well, it's great to have the chance to talk to you, and thank you so much for joining these Sentientist conversations. It feels like we've been in touch for a long while. You were one of the earliest members in the Sentientism Facebook group, and we've had some
That's
fascinating...
right. I was too shy to come on early, but now after some people had to go, I think I'm ready.
Yeah, you've been requested, so it's great to have you here.
That's right. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, and as you know, these conversations center around what I think are the two deepest philosophical questions: what's real and what matters. And I've got a bias, obviously, because I'm talking in context of this modern recasting of the worldview of sentientism that I'm trying to promote and develop communities around, which answers those two questions by saying when it comes to what's real, we should take a naturalistic approach, using evidence and reason and probabilistically and provisionally building understanding about the world with humility and open-mindedness, hopefully. And when it comes to what matters, the clue is in the name, that we should grant moral consideration for any being, any entity that is sentient or has the capacity for suffering and flourishing and so on. And we'll get into, what that means, the implications of it, given the depth of your work
awesome.
in exactly that space.
Things to say about that.
Absolutely, you do. Absolutely. But before we get on to those two central questions, how would you best introduce yourself for people who don't know of your work already?
Yeah, well, I'm Walter White. I'm doing here a PhD at the University of Sydney with Paul Griffiths and Peter Godfrey Smith. Peter Godfrey Smith might be familiar to some because of his work on animal consciousness. How did I end up here? Well, from my accent, you might know that I'm from Germany. That's probably telling. I don't exactly know how it all started. I think I started to think about philosophy quite early on. I recall my mother saying something like, she can't imagine me being anything but a philosopher. I thought I would go into studying economics or something, but we had this one class in school of philosophy, and that was really exciting. I was interestingly defending Descartes and talking about rationalism, giving a presentation about that. Now I'm quite the anti-Cartesian, so it's an interesting journey. I studied philosophy and economics, nice combination, obviously, in Bayreuth, which was sort of modeled after the Oxford-style PPE programs, politics, philosophy, and economics. And you get a lot of people there that are interested in justice. You had this quite after the global financial crisis, the Euro crisis. People were interested in how our economic system is built and how we can make it fairer. I was more interested in the philosophical issues and also the science issues. So I'm going into philosophy of science more and more. And I did a master degree in Bristol on the philosophy of biology and cognitive sciences. Getting more into sort of how the brain works, the mind works. And now I'm here doing a PhD on the philosophy of consciousness. And it fits very well with your podcast, obviously, because I'm sort of defending the view of how sentience came to be. How did sentience arise in a purely physical universe?
Yeah, wonderful. Well, it's fascinating. And yeah, it'll be good to get onto your current hypothesis and how you think about those things. But before we get to that, the first question I'd like to ask is that question, what's real? So for many people, that's a story about whether they grew up in a naturalistic, atheistic sort of context or a more religious, spiritual one in terms of household and society, but how that side of their philosophy has shifted over time, if it has. So it'd be interesting. You can wind the clock back as far as you like, but it'd be good to know your story on that sort of supernatural, natural.
My parents have always been kind of maybe a bit agnostic, but perhaps more so in the sense that they weren't interested in going to church. My aunt was very much into the church and she very much wanted us all to go there. So my father and his parents, my grandparents, went to church sort of grumblingly. They didn't really want to go, and I didn't really know what was going on there. There was not much talk about God at all. So when I went to school and we had to learn about God there. That was kind of strange to me. It was probably my worst grades. I didn't know what was going on there. I think my first years in school, I was this ADHD child. I was just annoying to the teacher and asking annoying questions. And I think I never stopped, at least in religious classes.
Yeah.
I never got the hang of it. I was, well, so you can see I'm quite the atheist. I think there was a phase when I was maybe 13, 14, which I seem to recall that I actually believed in God, where I thought, oh, it seems undoubtedly true. I didn't know my reasons as much, it just seemed true back then. And then I quickly lost it, I guess, with puberty. I just didn't see the reasons for it. So what made me so convinced when I was 14, I don't really know anymore. It's just, it seemed like the way you make sense of the universe and everything is just, oh, there must be something like this. And I think once you come to learn more about the world, you make sense of it in a different way. And I guess that's perfectly how we've seen it in the past. The more we learn about science, the more atheists there are. So that's a perfectly natural development, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the people I've talked to so far, it seems that skeptics and atheists, they go one of two ways. Either they get brilliant marks in religious education or terrible marks. And I'm not sure how it is, but they seem to go one way or the other. But yeah, it's an interesting evolution because in a way, given, we're evolved higher apes with certain, reasonably limited capabilities, it's somewhat understandable that as we look out and observe the wonder and awe of the universe that we, want to posit answers, particularly ones that seem sort of emotionally easy. So, but it sounds like you never really believed. There was a moment where you did, and then again, it drifted away. But it doesn't sound like it was a particularly difficult journey for you to go on, because if your family weren't particularly serious about religion in that context, did it feel at any point like it was something you were grappling with, or did it never really seem that centrally important?
No, to me, it seemed perfectly clear, both at one point when I was like 14, that it was true that God exists, and then later on that it was clearly false. And I think when I was younger than that, I didn't even grasp the concept because my parents never really taught it to me. Right? Like people talking about God, going to church, it just seemed more like this weird cult-like thing. People going there, what is even going on? There's music, now I have to stand and sing. I don't know what's going on. Very embarrassing situations when family members died and I had to go to church and do stuff, and it's all this procedures and you have to follow orders. Oh, and the ritual. It's weird. It's weird.
And from the people I've talked to, most of them started out in some sort of religious context, either a quite gentle one like yours or mine, or in some cases a very intense one where the religiosity really defined the society and the family and the culture, and those people had a much tougher journey away. But some people's move away from a religious way of thinking is one of that sort of just a feeling and a sensation. For other people, it's more of a technical thing around, look, I've looked at the evidence and the evidence doesn't seem strong, and I've looked at other religions and there are conflicts and there's inconsistency. So it's more of a logical facts and reason and evidence thing that pulls them away from it. And for other people, it's more about seeing some of the ethics that flow through formalized religions as well. So on the one hand, they'll see there's a lot of, deep, genuine compassion and love in this religious system, but there's also some ethics that just don't sit right with me, whether it's forms of discrimination or, threatening children with burning in hell for eternity or whatever it is. Was there any ethical side to your sort of moving back away from a religious way of thinking, or was it more about?
I think a lot of people who leave religions often do it for ethical reasons, or maybe they don't fit with the culture anymore. But to me, religion never was much about this anyway, because I went to church once per year when I had to go to this Christmas event where the entire school went, so it had nothing to do with my parents. So to me, it was purely about sort of making sense of the world. And if you think that's what philosophy is about, trying to make sense of everything, eventually it just didn't make sense anymore to me. And I think that's a very natural thing once you start to learn about evolutionary biology and a lot of other things, where religion seems kind of weird. I mean, especially if you think there's, I don't know, 10,000 religions and presumably only one can be right. So purely logically, it seemed to me, well, I just go one step further and deny that one more religion is false, right?
And where you, many of my guests have moved away from an organized religion, and most of them have stayed, I think, like you and me, pretty clearly atheistic and naturalistic in all respects, in all domains. But some have either temporarily or longer term been tempted back into something that feels like a sense of transcendence or spirituality, or other fields of what you might call as the supernatural or the transcendent. Have you ever been tempted down any of those roads at all, or have you always been a sort of hard-edged naturalistic person?
Yeah, I think I've been,
in all respects.
To be fair, so I'm very much a hardcore naturalist now, radical perhaps even. But I used to play chess, and I was superstitious. I would do the same kind of rituals each game where I was thinking, oh, well, this worked. Well, last time, almost conditioning myself like a pigeon used by B.F. Skinner, self-conditioning, right? They thought, oh, well, this condition, I did this the last time I got food, and eventually they're doing this elaborate dance, which I guess does actually make sense if you think there's a lot of continuity between us and other animals. And eventually, I think, becoming more and more convinced of this naturalist worldview, superstitions didn't make sense to me anymore, which was a great thing because as a kid, I got scared of, I don't know, seeing a scary face in the mirror or the dark. And in a way, it always seemed to be like, damn, like, what is the benefit here? You get God, but by believing in all these non-naturalist things, you also get to believe in monsters, ghosts, and all these scary things. You can believe in hell. So in a way, it's almost like a trade-off. You lose an eternal life in heaven with all your friends, but you also lose all these fucking scary things, right? There's no hell anymore. And that's, in one sense, a much more comforting view. You just get to enjoy your life. You can make sense of this wondrous universe. So I think if you're a scientist, in a sense, more inclined to want to find out more about the natural world, I think this worldview comes much easier. And I think that makes me probably a bit atypical. I think most people have the sort of sense that, I guess, there must be something, but I guess you can get it from sports, right? In the US, you see that when people almost religiously go to sports events, and well, that seems to work pretty well. I was brought up in Germany, and after the Second World War, obviously, bred into us to be anti-collectivists, to be conflicted about seeing these kind of things. And I wonder if one of the only ways in Germany where you can still be a collectivist in a sense is to be part of this bigger, perhaps, Catholics, Protestants. I guess you still have it with sports clubs, I'm sure. Bayern Munich, there's lots of people who treat it as a kind of religion. But yeah, I don't think I had much of an interest in that.
Yeah, makes sense. And one of the other themes that's come through these conversations is the fact that I think even within a purely naturalistic worldview, you can still have a sense of awe and wonder and connectedness of all things that emotionally can feel very similar to what I think religious or supernatural people have. But you don't have to believe things that aren't true to recognize that stuff. You just need to, as you say, understand, our partial understanding of science and physics and biology, and everything is connected ultimately, right? We're all stardust. And so I don't think you need to lose that sense of awe and wonder by being a naturalistic person.
I completely agree. You don't have to make up magic to see the magic in the world, right?
Yeah.
Becoming a naturalist isn't like going through the world with your color vision taken away, seeing everything in gray.
Yeah.
That's not really how it is. You see the world and you just wonder how everything works. And it's a peculiar world we live in, and it's exciting in a way.
Yeah, it's a privilege to be here. We're either extremely lucky to be here, or given determinism, it was absolutely guaranteed, 100% probable that we would be here right now having this conversation. So,
well, I believe in quantum physics, so I think if you play back the tape, then many different things.
Yeah, maybe there's some probabilistic wiggle room there. So
that's right.
Well, so that brings us on to the second deep question we like to ask: what matters morally? And one of the reasons that some people are nervous about moving away from a religious worldview is because, however flawed the ethics might be, at least there's a list of rules and there's a deity that will judge you, and there's punishment and so on. So some people are nervous that if you move away from that supernatural worldview, you lose any grounding for your ethics at all. And if the world is just, the laws of physics operating mindlessly, how can we find any meaning in that? So I guess there's two questions that I'd like to ask here. One is, okay, so I think you are, from my interactions with you, a moral person. I don't think you're amoral or immoral. I don't think you're running around harming other people for fun, for example. So what is your morality grounded on? And again, what sort of journey did you go through to come to that view? But there's a second part of the question, which is, assuming you do have some form of morality, how is it bounded and what gets included in your moral consideration? And again, how did that perspective shift through your life as well?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question to ask, because I have a very interesting position in a sense that I would agree with many on the religious side that once you lose God, ethics indeed seems to start to crumble, in the sense that how do we justify it, our moral norms, right? What gives them the normative force? If you think, well, it's God, that makes lots of sense. It's just this dude in the sky making up laws, and you just have to follow them. That makes sense.
Although even there, you could argue, you could ask the question, why should we obey God?
Sure.
But yes, let's go with your
the dilemma. So even that might not make as much sense, but you could think it's just the same normative force you get with laws.
Yeah.
And right, like people who are skeptical about morality, they're not skeptical about the normative force of laws, right? It's just someone making up these rules, and I guess you don't have to follow them, but then you go to prison, and then in the same sense, you could go to hell, right? So you had philosophers talking for thousands of years about what justifies morality and why should we act morally. That has been a big question until now. And I always had my problems with most moral theories, because they almost seemed religious-like, to pluck categorical imperatives from thin air, talk about virtue ethics. The only ethics that ever made sense to me was utilitarianism. Why is that? Because it was, to me, it almost seemed like, if it works, the way Bentham thought about it, he almost didn't treat it as a form of morality. I almost think he wanted to treat it as a form of science. If you think well-being isn't a choice, it's not just a fact of our moral theory, whichever we apply, that makes your life go well. It's a fact, and that could be in principle investigated with the tools of science. And I think you kind of see that in the way utilitarians in Britain worked, who wanted to be engaged in politics, who wanted to create a better world for the people, who wanted to make the lives of people go better. And now people are going to say, oh, well, that's clearly a moral concept. But I am not so sure. In fact, I think there's a purely naturalist fact of the matter, whether your life is going well from your own perspective. And animal welfare scientists have been engaged in this for decades. Right? Animal welfare scientists don't ask, oh, what is the true morality that we have to follow? This is how we ought to treat animals. They simply ask, what do the animals want? What makes them suffer? What gives them pleasure? What gives them a good life from their own point of view? And I find it extremely compelling. So even though I deny that there's a sort of second order meta-ethical theory that grounds this all, in that sense, it makes me a nihilist. I think there is no normative force. The fact of the matter is purely there are beings in the world who have interests, and they can be harmed in a purely naturalist sense, and that's just the fact of the matter. Right? You can choose to harm people, but then there's a fact of the matter that you're harming them. It's not something you have to buy by buying into some form of moral theory, like the Kantian categorical imperative. Any psychopath who doesn't believe in morality, who doesn't care about it, can recognize that the actions are harming others.
Yeah.
But they don't care. Humans are quite the social species. We have to thank evolution for that, and also culture. That just makes us care about the interests of others. So I actually think that morality is perhaps bad in the sense that it's sometimes used to justify what you would call immoral, but I just mean that morality might create more harms in the purely naturalist sense, that the interests of people become violated, even though that promotes justice or the good or whatever else you postulate there, right? You could have a Kantian theory, and any Kantian could grant that, well, you all have to follow these rules, even though the well-being of everyone might be lower, which is an interesting theory to hold, and to me, it never made much sense. Yeah. So utilitarianism, I treat it almost as, look, we're all beings in this world, we all have interests, and it makes sense for us to collaborate and cooperate in a way that takes all of our interests into account. And then there is no dividing line between us as humans and other animals, if they have interests, which I think they do. But morality, I think, has been used to almost create this dividing line between us and other animals, in the very same way that religion has been used to create a dividing line between us and other animals. Think about the way morality has been used to promote sexism, racism, the way the Nazis or any other terrible group in the past has justified the actions has been through an appeal to morality. And now everyone who believes in their own moral theory or whatever, they can say, oh, well, but actually they didn't follow morality because the one true morality wouldn't have recommended it. But that fails to recognize that a lot of bad acts haven't only been committed in the sake of God, but in the very same sense for morality. So I think there's a very deep connection between morality and spirituality, religion, that's often not recognized among naturalists and atheists. And that makes a lot of sense because we are attacked on the basis of being nihilists, of getting rid of morality, of being evil. Of course, you see the statistics and you see that atheists are no less immoral than anyone else. The statistics, I think, show that we commit less crimes, we're more loyal to our partners. It's interesting the way naturalists have tried to ground a purely naturalist morality, and I think it can be done in a very weak sense of, look, we're all beings in the world who care about things, and yes, we want to organize the world in a way that's better in a purely naturalist sense, that it's better from the sentient beings on this world's points of view. You don't need any morality here. You don't need spirituality. Nothing mysterious going on. It's a purely naturalist fact. Now you could maximize suffering, would be a purely naturalist thing as well. Why would you do that though? So I think we have reasons to create a society that promotes these rules.
That's fascinating. And I think it's almost as though from a naturalistic atheistic worldview, we feel driven to compete with a religious morality by having one that is sort of, again, sort of superordinate and pure and meta-ethical. And that can lead us to actually create moralities that have negative consequences and negative utility and negative outcomes. And there's risk there, partly because we're trying to compete in a way that I don't think we need to. And, you know, I'm not a philosopher myself, so it's very much an amateur view, and I personally, share your sympathies on those lines, right? Because I think, you know, deontological rules can be useful rules of thumb, and, you know, virtues can be useful as well, but only if they consistently deliver positive utility consequences. so in
utilitarian,
sort of, yeah. And I'm nervous about some approaches to utilitarianism, about, you know, aggregation and various other things, but I'm more comfortable at least saying, you know, I'm more of a consequentialist, right? Because ultimately, if there is any such thing as value, to me, it is in the quality of the experiences of sentient beings. And you can, when you talk about anything that people think of as value, and you keep asking why is that of value, ultimately, I think you come back to, you know, its experience on the quality of it, on the quality of an experience of a sentient being. So, and that, the way I'm trying to frame sentientism actually stays out of that fight and says, look, you could be a virtue ethicist or a deontologist or a Kantian, like Christine Korsgaard, as long as you include all sentient beings in your moral consideration, you could still do that in a sentientist way. But personally, my proclivities are more along the consequentialist utilitarian flavor of those. But I think there's another interesting discussion which links to that, which is about moral realism as well. So in a sense, I think you're saying there is no such thing as, you're not a moral realist, right? There's no external moral truth.
I would say I'm a moral anti-realist. Hardcore. I think so. Some naturalists, they try to argue for sort of evolutionary moral realism, evolutionary naturalism about morality, which kind of works, but the very same arguments are used by moral anti-realists to say, oh, well, morality doesn't exist in this way. Anyone except us naturalists thinks about it.
And there's a risk of cherry picking as well, because if you're going to pick the good bits of how the positive aspects of morality evolved as they did, you also have to look at the negative aspects of morality that also evolved. And you know, and nature doesn't, you know, nature isn't a good guide to morality generally.
I mean, you don't perhaps want to draw on Nietzsche to make moral arguments, but he made this point that there is the slave morality and this master morality, and sometimes it's read as, oh, we need the master morality, but he wanted to say, move beyond good and evil, right? So the people in power, they use morality to reinforce their status, whereas the people who are the slaves, they use morality to demand equality. So of course, we use morality to promote our own interests. And I, as an anti-realist, am concerned that if people with different interests meet each other and appeal to the different moral values, that's just the very same thing as people appealing to the different gods and then killing each other. It's very similar. There is no way you can resolve conflicts between people that make their own interests into these higher order values that are just matters of facts in a way, and the other side is just wrong. So I think by accepting that that's not real, you just accept that there's different people with different interests, and it gives you a very different view of other people. You might really dislike what they think, what they believe, what they value, but you probably wouldn't kill them for it because they're convinced by evil and motivated by that. And I think that the way morality evolved, that was for hunter-gatherer groups of perhaps 100 people to enable cooperation there. but I'm skeptical that this works on a global scale. Now, moralists kind of appeal to all the good things morality did, but in a way, that's just cherry picking.
Yeah.
And anyone does it.
And I think there's a couple of reasons why people sort of drive for a moral realism. One is to compete with that sort of religious moral structure and say, look, we have to have something at a similar level.
Yeah, I agree.
At a similar level of clarity. But another one is that they're nervous about, I guess, relativism. You know, in a sense that anything goes morally. It's just a question of what we manage to negotiate amongst ourselves. You know, there is no good or bad. It's just what a certain group of humans have come to agree, even if that causes egregious suffering. And in a way, I end up with a, again, amateurish approach, which says, look, I don't think moral realism is true in the sense that if there were no sentient beings in the universe, there would be no morality. Like, it wouldn't even have a meaning if we have a completely insentient universe with no value and no. So I'm not a moral realist in that sense, but in a way, I'm sort of a moral realist in the sense of a completely naturalistic understanding of what sentient beings are, what the nature of sentience is likely to be. So in a way, that's a very weak form of realism that basically says, look, I don't like suffering. I'm pretty confident other sentient beings don't like suffering either. And if morality is anything, it's a concern for others. And therefore, you know, if we ground our morality, then we ground it in a naturalistic understanding of the fact that sentient beings don't like suffering and have interests.
Yeah,
so it's maybe that's a very weak form of realism, but it avoids the, you know, anything goes relativism. Throwing gay people off roofs is morally good if we've agreed that's what we're going to do.
I think you're on a very good track there. So if you think, like most sentientists, that sentience is what matters, right? That you can be harmed, the purely naturalist fact, then you're going to criticize a lot of moral theorizing that doesn't take sentience at the core, right? That puts suffering and pleasure at the center of moral theorizing, right? What is the purpose of our moral laws, of our rules, the way we design society, if it leads to more suffering that would have otherwise existed, almost seems to undermine the purpose of morality. Now, in an evolutionary sense, that might not be the way morality evolved, so that's a different purpose. It's the purpose we want morality to be used for, right? What is it good for us as sentient agents? And that's promoting our interests, our wants to have a good life. And I think you're right that there's a purely naturalist fact of the matter that a pig in a slaughterhouse is not going to have a great life. They're going to suffer. And I think, in a sense, that recognizing this as a naturalist fact makes it much harder to get out of this by sort of appealing, oh, well, we are humans, morality is just about humans. In a way, you would have to say, yes, I am harming them because I don't care. And that's a very different way of saying things than, oh, yes, maybe there's some harm involved, but morality doesn't give us these hard rules about how to treat other animals. It's this weaseling out that you kind of don't get. Though, to be fair, you get a different kind of weaseling in the sense that you could weasel yourself out of anything. But I mean, that's right. Like if you tell the psychopath in the courtroom that what they did was wrong, they can be like, yeah, but so what? I think that just shouldn't be the basis of society.
No, I agree, and I think in a sense, whatever moral system you have, someone can always say, but I am choosing not to care about the suffering of others. Well, okay, that's fine. You can do that, but you're just choosing not to be moral. And hopefully the rest of us will constrain you. Right. So, right. I mean, I'm not sure there's much more to say about it. And as you say, of course, our propensity to be moral, and you've done some fascinating work on this as well, evolved it naturally long before humans came on the scene through, the evolutionary value of kin, selection and reciprocity, and and so if you like, that's where the genesis of our moral thinking and our capacity to consider these things came from. But those don't define what's a good outcome, right? We're, in a way, we've got the cognitive capacity to pick up those concepts and what we were given evolutionary, and then to decide what we want to care about and what we don't want to care about. So in a way, morality itself is not an external thing, right? It is a construct that we formalized that has some evolutionary basis, but we're deciding what it means now. So
I think that's very right. So in a way, you should ask, who do we care about?
Yeah.
And now, as sentientists, we want to say we should care about sentient beings. And I am not claiming that we have to include animals, right? I'm not claiming that this is a sort of a must, but not doing so makes you a speciesist, right? It just shows that you don't care. There's nothing different here than saying, I don't care about people of a different race. If you
again, it's a choice not to be moral, or just to arbitrarily exclude.
It's a choice. You could include anyone you like. The way sentientists do it is the most naturalist way of doing it, I think. It's just asking, well, who has interests, who can be harmed, and then let's include all those beings in our moral circle. It's very straightforward.
Yeah. And it would be interesting to know how your personal journey evolved on that front as well. How early in your thinking did you start to seriously extend moral consideration to non-humans? And again, was that a difficult journey or a quick one?
Yeah, I wonder. I always liked animals. My parents wanted to become zoo directors when they were children. They didn't manage to because their parents told them, oh, well, that's not a serious job, do something real. Now I'm engaged to Hedda Browning, who is a zookeeper turned philosopher, who works on animal sentience and animal ethics, and is particularly interested in not in arcane theorizing of animal freedom and sort of how to treat them in this very arcane sense. What she's interested in are these naturalist facts of how can we do science to find out what animals really want, how can we find out whether animals are doing well, instead of just looking at them and thinking, oh, they're in a cage, so their life must be bad, which I think lots of people who are very much concerned with animal welfare, many people think zoos are just intrinsically bad because an animal is in a cage. But if an animal doesn't have a concept of freedom and it's having a great life, it loves its surroundings, it loves the fact that it's not full of parasites or other diseases or injured and gets good food every day, then what gives us from a naturalist perspective the right to say, well, our moral theory says it's just intrinsically bad to the animal to live in a zoo. So obviously there are zoos that are badly managed, but I think sometimes we get a sense of almost fantasizing about how lovely life in the wild is.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's a really interesting angle, because I hadn't thought about that concept in the context of zoos, which, as you say, almost most in the animal advocacy community will just condemn almost without thought, right? And for some good reason, given some of the conditions. But I think that's a really important point, because the essence of this whole thing for me is imperfectly but genuinely trying to take the perspective of the other sentient being. And that's really what matters. It's not, our view or our wishful thinking about their experience. It's what their experience really is. And we can't know that perfectly, but we can develop evidence and understanding about it. And it's their perspective that matters, not, our anthropomorphized perspective or our sort of natural fallacy, wishful thinking perspective. It's genuinely trying to take the perspective of the other, as we should do in human ethics.
That's right. So I think I agree with this almost completely, except for one thing, and that's this thing, and it's this move of saying, look, there are things that matter to animals, And that's what matters. I don't want to make this distinction between objective mattering and subjective mattering. Leave the objective mattering just out of the picture. There's a fact of the matter that things matter to subjects, and that's just mattering. There isn't any other mattering.
Yeah.
There isn't anything else we should discuss here. And I think perhaps that would make it easier to advocate the interests of animals, because then there is not a second question to be asked. For instance, oh, well, but are they free?
Yeah.
It's what matters is whether from their own perspective, they are having a good life, whether they're doing well. It's not, they probably don't have a perspective on their entire life, but that's not what matters. The way we should think about this is by aggregating every instance of the life, right? You should think, oh, is the animal having a good life right now, and then aggregate it over time. And you see this in humans a lot, and there it gets a bit sketchy, and I think that's why some oppose utilitarianism. It's this idea that, so one example we have, think about two humans who, if you just aggregate their well-being over their entire life, have the very same well-being. But in one case, someone starts out rich, have a really good education, but then they get sick and they lose all their money. And at the end of their life, they're doing very poorly. They lost everything. They were a famous musician and then they lost everything. And the other case is the complete opposite. Someone was poor and works themselves up. Now, both this person and other people often look at this other case with someone where their life improves as something better. I think that's a bit of a mistake. It's a bit of a bias looking at this. I think we have to distinguish which kind of life we want, whether from the question, which life is just objectively better to the person. And now this gets very tricky, I think, in the case of humans. And that's why people don't like very simplistic hedonistic accounts of utilitarianism. I think you can accommodate this by being a bit neutral about what matters to individuals. So I, for instance, might very well choose to jump in front of a car to save my loved ones, even though I know that's gonna cause me great suffering and it's gonna make my life worse, but I still make the choice. So I value it more. And I think that's perfectly fine, and that's not in any way in conflict with utilitarianism, as long as you're just a bit neutral on what matters to the individual. So I think in the sense that I think, again, we see something, we look at what humans value or animals, and then we try to make a second order judgment about what really matters, what really matters, and then restrict it in some sense.
Yeah.
You know, we don't have to do that.
I agree. And I like the point you make about not being too narrowly focused on a sort of very simplistic hedonistic view, because I think many people look at utilitarianism or even a concept of sentience and say it's just physical pains and pleasures. And that's not the way I think of sentience at all, right? I think it's mind-bendingly rich, even within our own species, right? So for me, you know, I talk about suffering and flourishing as being almost any qualitatively negative experience is suffering. So that can be, you know, yes, physical pain, but it can also be existential angst and a sense of loss and a sense of disappointment, and flourishing could be any qualitatively positive experience. So yes, physical pleasures, but also a sense of love and wonder and connectedness and aesthetic appreciation. And, you know, there's an incredible range of experiences just within our species, let alone when you start to, you know, mess with our own mind with psychedelics or meditation or drugs or illnesses that can shift it. And then you expand that consideration of what sentience might be like for other species and potentially, you know, even future artificial intelligences or future, you know, amendments we might make to our own sentience. It's mind-bendingly rich and broad. So I think that's the thing. And I love the way you put that, you know, try and break down that subject-object distinction about what matters, because in a sense, of course, there's subjectivity in the sense that, you know, you and I are largely separate entities with a perception and a cognition and an experience that will differ. So in a sense, that's subjective, but we're both part of the same objective universe, right? There's no magical separation. It's just the fact, my experience is the fact of the matter, and that matters. So I like that. I like that collapsing. So
yeah, I agree with that.
And sorry, go on.
That's just the way we should move forward. Just start to think more about what matters to subjects. And you had this in the utilitarians as well. Utilitarians are always criticized as having led to all kinds of atrocities. The opposite is true. Utilitarians were at the forefront of promoting women's rights, gay rights, the rights of anyone who's a different race. Utilitarians always tried to make people consider the interests of everyone, sort of break down these artificial moral boundaries that we have talked ourselves into.
Push the arbitrary, irrelevant characteristics to one side, and consider that. And in a way, that's part of the intent behind this reframing of sentientism. Is it's not just about single issue, let's have moral consideration for sentient non-humans. It also has direct implications for human ethics as well, in a similar way that secular humanism tries to do. It says, look, race, gender, sex, caste, these other characteristics are arbitrary and not relevant for granting moral consideration. We should have compassion for the whole human race. So sentientism basically says, and we shouldn't stop there, because non-humans can be sentient too, but it still has the same impact in human ethics, and pushing aside all of those other forms of discrimination and those arbitrary classifications.
One thing I actually think that far too few people talk about, except in Oxford, which for some reason is this utilitarian hub. So I think about long-termism here, which is the sense that, look, there's going to be sentient beings in the future. Now, even if we disregard animals, there's a sense in which our current politics take very little into consideration the interests of future human beings, right? If you compare the numbers of humans alive now to the number of humans alive in the future, if they could vote, we would vastly restrict the way we deal with our planet, the way we pollute the environment. It's almost insane. So I actually wonder how to handle this. If you think about democracy, it almost designs our moral system in a way that it's a fight between the interests of current humans that are alive, right? The political issues that we debate are where the interests of current humans clash. And that makes sort of the core of all of our political conflicts. But few discussions then happen about future humans, except for those who actually advocate fighting climate change and investing in future generations.
And those future generations, really are voiceless, right? I mean, they don't yet exist.
They can't march. They can't march for themselves to promote their own interests. They're the most silenced group of all. They're the most disadvantaged group, right? Like every harm we cause them by our current actions, they have no say in the matter, and it's like we don't even care.
I'd like to come back to that in the final section when we talk about the future, but there was two quick things I wanted to cover in this sort of what matters section, because one challenge to sentientism is that it goes too far and we should only care about humans, or more often humans and a selective subset of non-humans we choose to care about. And then the rest we can exploit. And you and I clearly disagree with that. The other criticism of sentientism is that it doesn't go too far enough, that it's too restrictive. And indeed, I think this was the first time the word sentientism was used, was actually as a criticism. And it was saying, I see sentientism, if you like, almost as the only moral discrimination, because it includes every being capable of suffering. And the only things it excludes don't care because they can't experience anything. So it feels like the right boundary to me, and I think to you as well. But some people say, no, it doesn't go far enough, and we need to think about biocentrism or ecocentrism that recognizes the intrinsic value of even of beings and, well, of entities that aren't sentient at all. So I'd be interested in your perspective on that.
Well, I obviously think these ideas are absurd. There's nothing intrinsically valuable about anything. Nothing. The only things that matter are the things that matter to a subject. And they matter in the sense that they matter to a subject. They're not mattering in a subjective sense. Now, the environment can matter to us.
Yes.
You don't
Deeply,
have to make it magical. If we care about the environment, if we care about species diversity, then yes, we have any moral reason to protect it. But we do that for us, in a sense. We don't do it for the system itself. And I think perhaps there's a bit of a tension in sentientism, because a lot of people want to promote the interests of animals because that just makes sense.
Yeah.
Because they can suffer, as I said, in a purely natural sense. But there's sort of, if you want to simplify it, I'm sure you could make a distinction between two groups caring about it, which is on the one hand, the purely scientifically minded people who think, just the fact of the matter, obviously there's evolutionary continuity, obviously these entities can suffer. And then there's, I'm sure, people who are more on the spiritualist side of let's expand our moral circle in the sense that yes, everything matters, and then perhaps that goes too far. This is more organistic thinking. You think more holistically about the whole world, where this other sense, whereas I guess a few decades ago, scientists would have been very reluctant to associate that with a cold stance. But in a sense, I think my stance is very cold. I just treat it as a fact. These entities are conscious. It's not a scientific taboo anymore. It's in a sense, if you think that chimpanzees don't feel pain, you should reconsider everything you've been taught at university. It's absurd.
Yeah, and that's very helpful. And one of the frustrations I've shared in these conversations, which I think brings that challenge to light, is where people have gone to a very generous, broad environmental concern, but still exclude large classes of very obviously sentient beings from their consideration. And arguably that type of environmentalism is really just a reflection of, yet again, selectively human interests. It's not really an expansion of the moral circle at all. And as you say, as even with a sentientist point of view, I personally have a very deep appreciation and value for the non-sentient environment and plants and trees and rocks and rivers and ecosystems because of their impact on the subjects that I care about. And that can be a very deep and genuine compassion. But the second question I wanted to ask you, because we spent most of the time on the philosophy side of your thinking, is the science side. So one of the other challenges to sentientism is, and similar to consciousness, anything that's based on consciousness, is to say, look, the concept is quite fuzzy. It's not yet well understood. Some people will use it as an excuse to yet again inject some sort of magic or mysticalism into the concept because we don't really understand it. So doesn't that undermine the viability of using sentience as some form of grounding for our way of thinking about ethics? So I'm interested in because you've done some brilliant work on this, and your current hypothesis. How would you describe what sentience is, and how did it develop?
So in the 70s, Donald Griffin tried to revive animal consciousness from the claws of the behaviorists who tried to ban it. And how could he do this? Well, he did this brilliant work on bats. He was the discoverer, when he was an undergrad at Harvard, that bats can echolocate. And at first, people didn't believe it. They thought he's crazy. Right? That didn't fit behaviorism either. And well, after more and more experiments, people accepted it, and he became a very renowned scientist, very famous for his very rigorous work. But then in the 70s, he tried to bring back animal consciousness. And he treated it perhaps in a bit vague way, right? He collected evidence from very different sources. It was more anecdotal. He tried to revive it, and people were very harsh. But it's largely thanks to him, I think, that now we see this revival that of a science of animal consciousness. And my dissertation is on this. I want to help make the science flourish into a post-Darwinian science of consciousness, in the same sense that we've come to have a post-Darwinian science of life. We don't look only on humans, we look at all the tree of life. Humans are just here one little branching point. And that's how I see consciousness. So you can see consciousness perhaps in two very different ways. One is a sort of transformation view. It's a sudden appearance at some point in the evolutionary tree. And I think some people associate that with great apes. Perhaps suddenly we get consciousness, and often consciousness is perceived as this very rich thinking. That's why animal consciousness researchers prefer often the term sentience now, which is this experience of sometimes more narrowly thinking of a positive and negative experience, the capability to have. Of course, that's not really different from consciousness if there's experience here, right? In a sense, perhaps there might even be consciousness appearing before there's any evaluation. So Peter Godfrey Smith thinks there might be a branching between a purely sensory side of consciousness and the sentient, the evaluative side of consciousness. I think that's false. So yes, we can make a distinction here in our imagination, in the same way that I could imagine you to be just a robot, to have no soul. Soul in the sense of consciousness, in the sense that people have used it pre-Cartesian way. So I think of sentience and consciousness very much in the same way. What does it mean to have no positive or negative experience? Well, you have a neutral experience. It's an evaluative way. So the way I think about consciousness is evaluative beings appearing in the tree of life. And I think that gets rid of this puzzle we have when we think about microbes, for instance, which is very interesting research, the way they sense the world and flexibly react. We wouldn't have believed it. The new results we learn now, and in the same way we learn new things about the brilliant things animals can do. But then if they do sensing and flexible action, what makes them different from animals doing this, right? Microbes. And I think the difference is the sort of evaluation. That's just not happening there. And I really like the 2017 Animal Consciousness Conference that happened at NYU, where Dennett gave a sort of closing talk in the end, where he tried to summarize everything. And the point of the conference was combining ethics and consciousness, bringing people from the different fields together to talk to each other, for how we should think about animal ethics and how we should think about animal consciousness. And then its talk was titled Suffering Matters. And that talk is quite influential for my thesis, because I am defending a pathological complexity thesis. So I invented the term. I think the function of consciousness is to deal with pathological complexity. And often what you get in philosophical debate is just to say, pain just intrinsically matters, intrinsically. But why does it matter? If you are thinking about science, you want to know why in a more evolutionary sense, why beings evolved that had aversive feelings or even positive ones. So what is it that makes pain painful? And I think the answer here is, as Dennett pointed out, that it's a certain kind of complexity. And I say it's pathological complexity. So I think what you get at the quite early evolution of the animal tree of life, and that I think happened perhaps even earlier than the Cambrian explosion, where you had flexible action evolving. And it's often underestimated how hard it is for a biological organism that's multicellular to move around in the world. That's actually quite hard. And the way we do animal experiments, often on cognition and sentience, is extremely restrictive. So you can sometimes, even with humans, these experiments are very similar. We have still this behaviorist heritage that tries to restrict the degrees of freedoms, the variables, to as few as possible in order to make our experimental result as tight as possible, to be as sure as possible that it's valid.
Isolating the factors.
That's right. But by increasing this validity, you lose something philosophers of science call ecological validity, which means that you might not learn much about the animal in its nature. So the ethologists early on argued we need to actually study animals more in the wild. And that's, I think, how we should actually treat consciousness. So the way sometimes we explain animal behavior in labs, if you want to buy the most restrictive sense of that, you wouldn't be able to explain the way animals act in the wild, the way they flexibly respond to things. It's almost like you're completely ignoring that for the pure sake of making your very restrictive experimental results as tight as possible. That's a problem precisely because I think consciousness is about dealing with high degrees of freedom.
Yeah.
Basically, you get this kind of complexity if you have lots of actions available, which is very costly. To have a body that enables you to engage in a vast range of actions that might either be harmful or good, but you have a costly body, that's a really high investment. Think about it in terms of research and development. This is a body that needs to be paid for. And the way you pay for it is by staying away from dangerous things and seeking out what is good for you in a purely biological sense, as a biological system, because you need to maintain your health, right? We have complex life cycles, at least most animals, and we gotta stick around for a while to procreate. And that's where I see the evolution of consciousness. In order to engage in these complex action trade-offs, in order to calculate what you should do, behavioral ecologists often just treat behavior as automatically adaptive. They treat the body as a black box that just links behavior to environment. You gotta explain the way organisms do it. You gotta look at the mechanistic side. And I think if we look at this, the evolution of evaluation of complex decision making, this is where we see the evolution of a kind of utility. I think the utilitarians were right. This is where we see the origins of interests, of preferences, of wants, needs that are felt, because that's the currency of decision making.
Yeah, that's a
really old idea, but it makes sense.
That's really where that's the roots of valence in the first place, right? And that story is very compelling to me, because it seems that these capacities have really evolved through the value, in an evolutionary sense, of an entity being able to represent and model itself and others and the environment, to be able to navigate that complexity in a way that enables it to survive.
So I think one problem we actually see in a lot of talking about consciousness is a very strong representationalist way of thinking. So I want to resist very strong versions of this. I just said that consciousness science has been very much based on vision, because you can just stick a human head into a box and limit his degrees of freedom, eye movement, saccades, very much limited, perfect for very constrained experiments, less so for learning about a complex agent, because it's very hard to think about why that is conscious or not, if it's actually not, even if you don't apply it in its natural environment, these skills. So the way you should think about it more, I think, is so Pierre Godfrey Smith thinks you can divide the sensory side from the evaluative side. And the evaluative side isn't being aware of some state, it's more of a way of being at the moment, the way things are for the system. And that's a more whole body experience rather than a particular feature of the world entering your experience. So think about vision later, because I think all of our models of consciousness have been based on vision and representation, and then extended to pain and moods and emotions. And it just doesn't fit that well if you think about anger. What does anger represent? I do think it represents something but it's not just this objective feature of the world that you look at in a purely physicalist sense. But it's not magical either.
Yeah.
You just got to think of the organism as a subject, and this is why I say pathological complexity. You got to think of what matters in a biological sense to the organism. You can't just put your own mind into the animal body. You got to think of what matters to the animal, and then think about what matters to the animal in the sense of a subjectively experiencing being. And I think by bringing in subjectivity, by treating subjectivity as something that gradually emerges, I think you get rid of this mystery, the hard problem, a hard dividing line. It just starts to make sense that beings evolve, that have an experience, that can be more or less experiential. I think there's different degrees of experience and different, often consciousness is treated as this one thing and you either have it or you don't have it.
Yeah, the light goes on.
I think that's a completely mistaken idea. I do think, however, that if you're interested in ethics, so for instance, Jonathan Birch is working on animal sentience, and even though he knows a lot about evolution, he's a philosopher of biology, he thinks in a sense that there is a hard dividing line. Either the lights are on and off. Daniel Dennett, Peter Godfrey Smith, me, I think Eva Jablonka, Simona Ginsburg as well, we think there must be a more gradualist story here.
Yeah.
There can be something like quasi-experience. And I think that's fine. That's like the way you wake up. You know, when I wake up in the morning, I wouldn't describe that as being conscious necessarily.
I know that feeling, hence the coffee.
That's right. This is the way we become sentient beings. You look, natural phenomena aren't just like a light that's either on or off. There's degrees of variation. We have varieties. We see varieties of subjective experience across humans. Finally, we're recognizing this, right? Finally, we're recognizing this, that the subjective experience of different humans are different. If you're a woman, your experiences are going to be different than if you're a man. And your experiences are shaped by the way your body is, the way your brain is organized. We see this in debates of neurodiversity, the experiences of someone with ADHD, someone with autism.
I mean, the richness is mind-blowing, and in a way, you know, my perspective is that sentience and consciousness are really just classes of information processing, and as such, you know, the variety can be pretty much unbounded. But I
want to qualify this. I think consciousness is a form of evaluative information processing, if you want to keep that word, because information processing goes on everywhere in your body.
I totally agree. No, absolutely. And I think this is because you make an interesting distinction between consciousness and sentience earlier on, because some people use them in fairly synonymous ways. And I agree in a sense that if you're going to be sentient, that implies there's some awareness, which is, you know, you're conscious of the valence. So in a sense, they're quite tightly linked. But I'd echo your point in that I quite like focusing on sentience, because in a sense, it feels like it's the morally salient component of consciousness, because some people will load other things into consciousness, you know, cognitive abilities or ability to plan for the future or a meta sense of the self. Or and I'm saying, well, that's all very interesting, but for moral consideration, the sentience is what counts as a subset. But in an interesting way, it also feels like it fits in another sense, because when you start thinking about, you know, going down the panpsychist route, right, where they all, I think they are making a mistake, because they're saying basically all information processing is conscious, and therefore everything is in a sense conscious, down to electrons and protons and so on. I mean, some forms of panpsychism.
So panpsychism is just a non-starter if you can tell even remotely plausible evolutionary story. Because what's your alternative here? To revise our complete worldview and think everything has a degree of consciousness in it? look, there's different ways of making sense of the world, and some just make more sense than others.
Yeah. And it's interesting because some sentientists are panpsychists as well. But they reckon, they might say that fine, an electron is in a sense minimally conscious, right? In that they are saying there is some sort of super proto basic experience going on, but they wouldn't claim that electron is sentient, because it doesn't have the capacity for any valenced experience, because it's just a bloody electron, right? You know, if there is something it's like to be an electron, it's very, very boring and nothing ever happens. So even in that sense, sentience becomes, you know, if you think all information processing is consciousness, then sentience becomes a richer concept. I mean, I think it's a bit of a, I'd take the mick out of panpsychists, because I think it's almost like, if you imagine looking at the code base of PowerPoint as a piece of software, and if you didn't understand how that code was put together, you'd look at it with mystery and go, you know, PowerPoint has to be more than that, because I can align to grid and I can distribute centrally, and I can look the wonder that is PowerPoint. I have this visceral experience of this thing that is PowerPoint. It can't just be the code. So maybe each line of code has to have the essence of PowerPoint within it. So maybe PowerPoint is the foundation of all physics. And
yeah,
I'm being a little unfair, but it feels like that pattern of thought. It's like we don't really understand how consciousness emerges from physical reality.
Yeah.
So maybe there's some magic embedded in every piece of reality. Job done. And it doesn't feel compelling to me. But
I think that's the very same reasoning I used when I was 14 and somehow thought, oh, well, how could you not think that God exists? It's just obvious.
yeah,
That's the way it seemed to make the most sense of the world at that point. Once you learn more about the world, this view becomes less plausible. And I think once you learn more about the brain and the way animals live in the wild, it just makes a lot of sense that there's evolutionary continuity. I think there's a special animal way of life that's not shared by all animals in the sense of being part of this tree, because some animals lost much of their nervous system and became less complex over evolutionary time. But for a whole lot of an animal tree, in the sense of there's the special animal mode of being, which is being complex in a complex world and having to make complex decisions, this is where you need some form of sentience.
Yeah. And I think
it's an efficient way of making choices.
And then in the future, I think we might well be able to design or create other forms of sentience or consciousness that aren't bound to a evolutionary history, because I think they're classes of information processing, and who knows what we might be able to design. And, you know, some of my conversations have talked about the possibility of artificially intelligent things becoming sentient or encountering aliens and so on. But the sentient entities that we're aware of now are biological. So you have to understand that in the context of an evolutionary set of drivers and imperatives and contexts that have led to the sentience that you and I share, or I think we share. So,
but the pathological complexity thesis I defend is clearly based on animals.
Yeah.
One case, or rather the living, because pathological complexity is something all organisms face. It's just that the pathological complexity animals face with the complex bodies is by degrees higher to need the system to have this complex experience to deal with the world. But I say pathological complexity because I think you can think of it as, look, living systems are goal-directed systems. And I treat pathology quite loosely here. I don't want to constrain it in the sense that we say something is a disease or not. But there are obstacles to goal-directed systems. There are ways that goal-directed systems need to maintain themselves in order to achieve their goals, which for living systems is procreation, self-maintenance, seeking out nutrients. Now, if you think about a computer, you might think that we can design complex goal-directed artificial systems that in a sense have pathological complexity then too, because they have goals. You can think about these fun robot matches that were sometimes aired on TV, where two teams build their own robot and let them fight. Obviously, they don't have sentience. But some have speculated that if you want to build a conscious robot or artificial intelligence, what you gotta give them is a sort of soft body that can be harmed. That makes a whole lot of sense if you think about it in terms of pathological complexity. If the robot needs to sort of map its body in order to evaluate what is going on in order to promote its goals. So I'm quite skeptical of sentience being instantiated in a purely information processing system.
Yeah.
I think there is something about sensory motor organization that is important in this picture.
Yeah. And again, I'm an amateur in the field of artificial intelligence, but there's certainly people within that field who are starting to recognize that sense of, you know, the AI needing to operate in an environment and go through learning experiences, and you know, it's not that easy to just, you know, run the code and have something emerge that is immediately sentient. There's something about experiencing the environment that is important. I mean, in technical terms, you know, I still see that in principle, there's no reason why you couldn't take some sort of form of sentience that has a biological evolutionary history and that pathological complexity drive, and then take the information processing that thing has done and instantiate it in some other reconfigured way to sort of bypass the process. But I agree in terms of, you know, how you get to the sentience. That's a compelling
Stephen
story.
Harnett said something important here. Right? We are robots as well.
Yeah.
Look, we are robots. They're just different robots. So clearly, I'm a naturalist. Obviously, it's instantiable in principle, but we don't know yet how it's done in animals and humans in particular. It could be multiply realizable. The thinking now is it might be a whole body event, or at least a whole brain event. It's important electricity waves, the way the whole system as a whole is organized. So it's very complex. Well, that's fair. It might be very complex. But if you think about the very simplest cases, if you think about bees, which I think are conscious, their brains are tiny. I have no reason to believe that if we create a very complex artificial machine that evaluates states of the world, that we might get something like quasi-experience. We could create a machine that has interests. And I want to defend a gradualist picture here, right? I think it's a mistake to say, oh, look, there's multiple entities and they're either conscious or not. Any ant matters as much as any human. I think this is a lot where the opposition to sentientism comes from, right? If we think about other dogs, it's very simple to think, oh yeah, they're just like us. They're here, they're an animal. They feel pain, we feel pain. No difference. The way we should calculate. But then if you introduce insects, that calculus kind of doesn't work anymore. Then we start to think, oh, maybe we need to rethink this here. Now I'm working with Hedda Browning. Obviously, although it's more like loose debates, though we've written a couple of articles. So we think, even if you think that insect experience matters much less because it's probably less rich, things matter less for an insect, also because they have a shorter life. So things naturally, you would expect them to matter less to them. There are so many more insects than there are humans. So I think once we expand our moral circle to insects, that might have quite radical revisions necessary in the way we organize society. But I think I think that's a mistake to think of sentientism as this crazy view that you give the same moral consideration to every insect than to a human.
Yeah.
Right.
It doesn't require that at all.
I wouldn't give the same moral consideration to me now than to me when I was young. When I was young, I went through the world. I had these colorful experiences. everything seemed really rich. Time, I experienced so much, but the older I get, I think that the poorer my conscious experience becomes. Now you can say, oh, well, now I value different things, like having a secure job, perhaps. Look, conscious experiences come in different ways, and it's not an insult to be have a less rich conscious experience in one sense than someone else. That's just a different way of being. It's nothing mysterious or magical here. Experience differs, and what matters, nevertheless, will be what matters to subjects.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, that brings us nicely onto the final question, because thank you for giving me so much of your time. Let me know if you need to run.
No,
but I guess the final question is, what's your vision for the future? So I like to ask my guests to try and take a more, optimistic cast and say, look, if you could imagine that we could persuade more of the 8 billion people on the planet to have a more naturalistic worldview, and to also have a more generous, compassionate worldview that recognize the moral salience of all sentient beings, what could that future look like? And you could go, super sci-fi if you like, or you can talk more immediately about challenges of human ethics, non-human animal ethics, the problems of the world, long-termism in the future. How do you think about the future?
I think it's a very complicated, obviously. Aggregating the interests of different beings isn't a problem that's unique to utilitarianism. I think some people got around that by just asserting something like, oh, look, we all have money, and then you can just buy, or you have a vote, and that gets aggregated. Perhaps that's less complicated. But that's assuming that this is going to work to promote the interests of every being. Clearly, that doesn't work to promote the interests of those outside your state, outside of those who can vote, especially animals and future humans. So in my ideal society, there probably wouldn't be any mass animal farming. I say probably because I think we could perhaps have genetic engineering in a sense that would make, that would give animals in cages great experiences, right? You could imagine almost a sort of experience-like machine way of being for an animal that has a great life from its own point of view. It looks terrible to us from the outside, but that's because we are imagining ourselves being in that cage, right? It's like imagining ourselves being a fly that's attracted to the feces of animals. Look, it just seems disgusting. It's not disgusting to the fly. You're failing to leave your own human interests behind, the way we humans perceive the world, and think about the way animals perceive the world. So I think in principle, you could have animals in these situations that have a great life from their own point of view, in which case I don't think there would necessarily be a moral problem. You might even think this is better than eating a cabbage, because then the animal might have great experiences. But obviously, this is super sci-fi.
And maybe cultured meat will mean we don't need to go quite to that level of the pig that wants to be eaten.
Yeah, let's first obviously get cultured meat. I'm very much in favor of clean meat. I've actually worked with one of your guests, Diana. We've written a bit on that, so perhaps that's going to be a publication one day. But yeah, I think it's important. Like, it's one of the most insane improvements we could implement to improve the lives of so many animals. But obviously, the meat industry is lobbying against that. And I think the way it was framed in the beginning, in vitro meat, that sounded a bit disgusting, right? Like, ugh, meat out of a printer. Who wants to eat that? But then you think, oh, clean meat, that's a better title. Yeah, no blood, no pain, no suffering.
Less environmental damage.
That's great. So there's no in principle opposition here. I would actually endorse that we forbid animal farming, at least in the way it's done in the US. It's better in Europe. It's worse in many other countries. Will it be implemented? No, I don't think so. Is it what we should do if we take into account interests of other animals? Obviously.
Yeah.
But it's not easy to go beyond your own interests, because your own interests are the only ones you feel, and expanding your own interests towards other animals, putting yourself into those different bodies, into those different experiences, that's pretty hard. And even I think some of our efforts, I think, are misused. I think a lot of zoo animals probably have a good life that's in a way good for our ecological diversity. Some of these species at the moment wouldn't be able to survive in the wild because we're destroying nature. These are all complex issues, and I think we almost need to get rid of morality in order to start caring about the interests of everyone.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'll just start putting values on the interests that matter and those that don't. But there's no distinction like that. There's no objective mattering. There's no intrinsic mattering that matters more than the simple interests of animals. The wants, the needs, the positive and negative experiences of anyone who has them. Nothing magical about that. That's the naturalist future I would like to envision.
Yeah, I like it. Well, that's a great vision. Thank you. Are there any other themes you'd like to lay into the conversation, or any other ideas about the way you'd like to see the world develop, or is that a good place to wrap up and let you go?
Yeah, I think we should start to think more about sentientism, obviously. And we have this interesting tension there, I think, between the scientific side, which is we want to find out what animal experience is like. And then there's the animal ethics side, which wants to improve the lives of animals. And sometimes actually not. Sometimes they want them to be free, even if the lives in the wild might be worse. Sometimes I think that's naive. Yeah. And so I think getting these together, it's not easy, but it's not completely hard either. It's the way animal consciousness has been reestablished is very much through the efforts by people who have been concerned with them. We have a lot to thank Peter Singer for. Otherwise, we might not care as much now about animals as we do. I'm very thankful to him. It's very important to finally sort of leave your own body and take the interests of others into account. And I think the way we should do it is by a sort of, look, just because we're doing animal consciousness research doesn't matter that we're biased not at all, right? It's not that we want to declare an animal conscious no matter what, to promote our moral views because we have this one world view, which is this crazy thing. No, we just care about animals suffering. There's nothing magical here. And to make it seem like one worldview among many, I think is very mistaken, which is why I want to dissociate it necessarily from morality. I just think, look, it's a natural fact that there are beings in the world that suffer, and we can do science about that. And that's what animal welfare scientists do, right? They do research on what matters to the animal from its own point of view. And yes, it's important that we actually care about that, because if you care what matters to the animal, then you're actually gonna care about doing good research to find out what matters to the animal from their own point of view. So I think they very naturally go together. And it's very pernicious to think that you could find out what matters to an animal if you don't care what matters to an animal. So I think sentientism is almost a necessary stance to find that out. And if you have a different stance, I think if someone goes into this research thinking animals don't matter, I don't know if you're gonna actually, if you then argue, or they probably don't feel pain, that seems more like you're trying to bring your own moral views in there. And that's sort of a battle we have to fight, but I think we're winning it at the moment. I think scientists are warming up to the idea that we can finally start to talk about this. The transition hasn't been completed. If you go to most animal behavior conferences and you talk a lot about their feelings and their possible subjective experiences, you're gonna get an odd look by quite a lot of, especially senior people. But I think our worldview is finally changing. Both the purely naturalist sense of the way the world is, but also in a loose moral sense of the way we want the world to be, which is to start to care about beings who care about the way their lives are going. And I hope we're making great strides towards it. I think your Sentientism page is a great thing to promote this goal, because Sentientism didn't have this platform really in the past, where people from very different backgrounds got together to promote it. And I think this is something we naturalists have a problem with. It's very difficult to organize, because unlike a religion where you have this one creed, it's hard to get different people with different interests together. But I actually think in the case of sentientism, it's really easy, because sentience isn't this controversial thing. Sentience is just whether a being can have positive or negative experience, and there's nothing magical yet.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great summary. And I think, and your work's, a powerful part of making this shift happen. It does feel like things are moving. And I agree that in a way, the idea behind sentientism is radically pluralistic, right? So you can have lots of different sorts of evidence. You can disagree about the interpretation. You can reason in different ways. You can have different thoughts about the right ethical system for trading off competing interests and, all sorts of other things that can matter. But it's unashamedly universal in the real basics, right? We have to be naturalistic. The best way to understand reality is to engage with it honestly. And we have to care about beings that care about their own existence. And that's it. Everything else, we can keep fighting about, but let's at least lock those two foundational elements in. And those to me feel more important and higher priority and more impactful than much of the more detailed work that goes on in different branches of science and philosophy, because so many people culturally and socially disagree with what you and I see as very, very simple foundational baselines in the way our thinking should be. So thank you very much for helping push that shift along. I look forward to all of your and Heather's future work.
Thanks so much for bringing me on board to talk. This was a great pleasure.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure. And I think the other thing we'll find, as we have already in human ethics, is that where we think there are difficult trade-offs, actually there are more win-win situations than we might have thought. Because I'd argue within human ethics, as we've extended our scope of moral consideration to try and, incompletely address the challenges of racism and sexism and homophobia and caste discrimination, extending the moral circle benefits the people who are doing the extending. And I think the same is true as we go beyond the human species. And whether that's, human health, whether it's the environmental crisis, many of the things we're talking about trying to make happen in the world are good for human animals, non-human animals, and our wider environment all at the same time. So let's see.
Yeah, great final words.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your kind words and your support. So before we wrap up, what's the best way of people finding you, finding your work, reading your theses and your articles? I can include links in the show notes, of course. So
If you look on Twitter, Walter White, I'm also on Facebook. You can go on my website. I think you're going to put it in the links, right? So, yeah, you can contact me. My email is written at least on some of those pages. I'm very happy to talk about animal sentience, animal consciousness, especially its evolution and the way we can use evolutionary thinking to reconstruct, to think about how animals probably experience the world, what it's like to be a bat, a bee, a dolphin. These are the questions that keep me up at night.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Walter. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to interviewing Heather too soon, hopefully. So,
Sure, thank you.
take care.